Welcome to the ACEIT podcast, where we turn science into sense. As we begin our 11th season, I wanted to let you know that JCOIN has a new O. That's right. The formerly Justice Community Opioid Innovation Network is now the Justice Community Overdose Innovation Network. Same wonderful network, same awesome podcast, but with a broader emphasis. So I am so excited that you're with us. I'm Danielle Rudes, your host, and this is ACEIT. Welcome to episode 7 of season 11 of the ACEIT podcast. On today's episode of our season on substance use disorder, overdose, and loved ones, we're talking all about involving loved ones in drug addiction and overdose treatment. This is an especially important topic to talk about, given research that finds that involving loved ones in addiction and overdose treatment improves outcomes. First, we'll talk about the research on people's perceptions of including loved ones in addiction and overdose treatment. That is, we'll discuss how loved ones actively contribute to the recovery process and how people receiving treatment feel about involving loved ones in their treatment. Then we'll talk about some of the barriers that prevent people from engaging in their loved ones' addiction and overdose treatment, as well as different ways that practitioners and researchers propose overcoming these barriers. Finally, we'll talk about some of the potential pitfalls, including loved ones in addiction and overdose treatment, including its impacts on relationships, and, as one scholar puts it, the deputizing of loved ones. Today, let's dive into all of that research. First, let's talk about the research on people's perceptions of including loved ones in addiction and overdose treatment. In semi-structured interviews with 25 young adults in treatment for opioid use disorder, Porter and colleagues, 2024, found that support from loved ones motivated people's treatment engagement and participation. For instance, people felt motivated to attend treatment in order to make their loved ones proud and feel supported when they received words of encouragement and praise, and practical assistance such as childcare and financial support. This brings up another important point: how people support their loved ones undergoing addiction treatment. Some family members make themselves actively involved in treatment by calling providers, while others provide practical support like childcare. They also help people navigate the recovery process and/or help with medication management. The majority of the young adults in their sample believed that loved ones' involvement in treatment was essential for recovery. However, some wanted their loved ones to provide more support than they already were. In a different study, Stumbo and colleagues, 2016, interviewed people who had a loved one overdose and found that even when loved ones were very involved in treatment, i.e. medication management, doctors rarely knew this was happening. The authors found that when patients, families, and providers worked together to develop a treatment plan, all parties had more positive outlooks. Collectively, this research suggests that loved ones play active and present roles in addiction recovery or overdose treatment. All right, now let's talk about some of the barriers that prevent people from engaging in their loved ones' addiction and overdose treatment, as well as different ways that practitioners and researchers propose overcoming these barriers. Primarily, the research in this area has centered around training loved ones for overdose response. A study conducted by Strang and colleagues, 2008, found that among loved ones who were caring for a person with addiction, only a quarter had ever received advice on how to respond to an overdose incident. Now, this study is a little dated, so these numbers may have increased in recent years, but the takeaway from this study is still very important. Loved ones can sometimes be the first responder in an overdose incident, and many of them are likely undertrained and underprepared. However, that is not to say that loved ones do not want to be prepared to help in case of an emergency. This study, and a more recent one conducted by Bagley and colleagues in 2015, found that the overwhelming majority of loved ones want to be trained to help in the case of an overdose, especially emergency naloxone administration. Beyond training, loved ones also really want tangible resources like naloxone rescue kits present in their home. This finding comes from the Bagley study that I just mentioned and another study conducted by Hansen and colleagues in 2020. Also importantly, researchers have documented that this training leads to good outcomes. Loved ones with more training have greater overdose-related knowledge and attitudes and higher confidence in their ability to provide aid, and these training effects are long-lasting. This all comes from research conducted by Hansen and colleagues 2020, Williams and colleagues 2014, and Resco and colleagues 2024. Collectively, this research suggests that training is a fruitful path forward to overdose prevention. Okay, finally, let's talk about some of the potential pitfalls of including loved ones in addiction and overdose treatment, including its impact on relationships and, as one scholar puts it, the deputizing of loved ones. The research on this topic is a bit more limited than the others, but there's still some interesting and useful information to unpack. The scholarship here mainly focuses on the impact of treatment involvement on relationships. In a law review study, Lawrence 2019 argues that loved ones are used as a regulatory tool to influence the decisions and behaviors of their loved ones while in treatment. In other words, loved ones are quote-unquote deputized and are responsible for providing care and, sometimes overbearing, oversight of their loved one's recovery journey. Lawrence points out that this dynamic has a lot of potential for interfering with loved ones' relationships with one another. I mean, this isn't really that crazy, is it? I know I wouldn't want a family member telling me what to do all the time, and I'm assuming you would feel the same. The study conducted by Stumbo and colleagues 2016 that I mentioned earlier sheds a bit more insight into this dynamic. Relationships suffered from a lot of stress and were sometimes fractured when patients and their loved ones had different perspectives of what constitutes effective pain management versus misuse and abuse. And these relationships and perceptions of attitudes are really important for recovery. For instance, a study conducted by Earnshaw and colleagues 2024 found that when people in opioid use disorder treatment faced stigma from their families, they were more likely to misuse drugs versus when they faced stigma from other sources. This underscores how important loved ones' support is in the recovery process, but this also must be weighed against the potential relationship issues that I just discussed. All right, with that, we've reached the end of our episode on involving loved ones in drug addiction and overdose treatment. The bottom line in all of this is that family support matters, and it has real implications for people's addiction and overdose experiences and well-being. I'll talk to you on the next episode, where we will be covering having unhoused loved ones with drug addiction and overdose incidents. As a reminder, if after listening to this episode you need support, please contact the 988 Suicide and Crisis Lifeline. Thank you for listening to the ACE-IT podcast. We love hearing from you. So if you have comments, topics to suggest, or some science you'd like us to cover in a future season, please write to me, Danielle Rudes, at Sam Houston State University in Texas. My email is drudes, D-R-U-D-E-S, at shsu.edu. And of course, thank you to the Justice Community Overdose Innovation Network, JCOIN's Coordination and Translation Center, funded by the National Institute on Drug Abuse, housed at George Mason University, where this podcast originated. Thank you to our fabulous scriptwriter and also my fantastic doctoral student, Bryce Kushmerek McCune. And a huge and heartfelt thank you to the team at Slonky LLC for their wonderful podcast production, as always. Tune in again for another episode of ACE-IT.